In this video, I want to talk about the Amish and why so many of them farm, and also why do they have home churches as opposed to a building to worship in. While it's true today that not all Amish people have huge farms and not all Amish use farming as their livelihood, it has been something that was very prevalent in the history of the Amish community. And why is that? Very quickly, we need to go back to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther decided as a bishop of the Catholic Church that he and many other bishops did not agree with a lot of the legalities that were going on in the Catholic Church. And so they separated themselves. They tried to change the rules and try to get along, per se, but the Catholic Church was very adamant about these are certain things that we have to follow. And that happens in different congregations. So Martin Luther, as well as many other bishops, over time started to separate and creating their own churches. The Amish actually separated from the Mennonites. The Mennonites were part of that original Reformation at the time of Martin Luther, but it wasn't until 1693 that Jacob Ammon decided to separate from the Mennonites. So now we have this group of Amish originated in 1693. Well, they were still considered part of the Protestant Reformation, and the Protestants during this time were getting persecuted. They were considered heretics. And a simple definition of that is it's a person that has an opposing view that is not generally accepted with the majority. So they're a heretic, and they were prosecuted. And we're talking people were put to death several different ways. I won't get into the horrific things that happened during that time, but this group was being persecuted. And many times they were told to leave their land, and then they would go to another country. Many of them came out of the Switzerland area, up into Germany, France, and scattered across Europe. But many times, depending on what was going on in those different countries at that time, they were told to leave and they were being displaced. So it was very, very important for this group of people to learn how to farm and to take care of themselves and to provide for themselves. It was also very, very important for them to have a place to worship. Now, obviously, they couldn't go into these new areas and just build a church. Remember, they're being persecuted. So building a church was not an option. And so the Amish started to meet in their homes. And that is where that comes from. They have held on to these traditions through all these years so that they can still hold on to their faith. The Amish will meet in their homes. And I remember interviewing an Amish neighbor and saying, well, how many people do you have in a community before you split? The Amish never have huge communities, 3, 4. We have churches today, 4,000 people that go to a church, right? You've seen them, the big, huge churches. The Amish will never get that big. They only get as big as a building will allow them to be. And this is what my Amish neighbor told me. He said, our particular sect, we typically get up to roughly 30 families. And he says the reason that we split is because nobody has a place big enough or a barn big enough to hold more than that. So he says, he goes, there's really not a number thing, but a location thing. Who has a large enough home that we can all get together and worship? If we start getting too big, then we'll decide logistically just to split in half so that people can still worship at people's homes. So they do not historically build a church and meet at a church. Now, here in my community, we do have a community building that the Mennonites built. They don't call it a church, but that's where they meet. And it's a kind of a community building that they'll come there and they'll have meetings. They'll have cookouts for the whole community where we're allowed to come. They'll have a barbecue, Labor Day, Memorial Day. And then they also meet there for church as well. So the Mennonites have moved to that in this area, but they don't call it, quote, a church. And there you have it. That is why many of your Amish will meet in their homes, and they have held on to that tradition of being good farmers.